Let's talk about 5 hard truths for scaling data-intensive applications. These are principles that we've learned through experience, through talking to people on our network, and helping customers scale data workloads in the cloud. We'll go through the whole thought process of how do you make sure you're working on the right things, all the way through to how do you set yourself up for success to make sure that you and the ecosystem of tooling and companies around you that support you are also successful. For each of the principles, we'll talk about a mindset or a quote that helps you think about the problem differently. And we'll ask a couple questions that you should really challenge yourself and your team with. First thing we want to talk about is limiting scope. You want to make sure that you're working on the right problems and focusing on customer pain. And I always go back to the mindset that I had in college of get it working, keep it working. And this goes right along with the concept of MVP when you're working in a startup, minimum viable product. Define what's needed, define the problem you're trying to solve, and focus in on the customer pain. That's what's going to drive revenue. And the challenging questions that I like to ask my customers or my friends with startups is, what's growing faster, your code base and your product backlog, or your customer base and your revenue? Make sure you're taking a step back and you're not just building the fun, fancy features, but you're really focusing on customer first. Don't design and build in a vacuum. Make sure that the feedback loop is tight and implemented well. Once you've designed the solution, you really need to design the customer experience and make sure you do it on purpose. In software engineering and software architecture, there's the concept of a runway, knowing how much time you have left with the application system or knowing how much capacity you have left. But think of this as an airplane sitting on a runway. You start rolling, going to take off, and as you go faster and faster, there's a point on the runway where you need to make a decision. You either need to step on the brakes so that you have enough time and room to stop so you can pivot and turn onto the taxiway, or you need to fully commit to taking off. And the important thing is you need to have all the information necessary up front to make that decision. You don't want to wait until you're at that spot to make the decision. And the same is true with software architecture. You want to make sure that you have all the capacity, all the information, all the observability, all the traceability, all the information necessary before you have to make that decision. Don't be surprised by it. And the question I like to challenge my customers and friends with is, how many customers is too many? And I like to think of orders of magnitude or multiples of 2x, 10x, 100x. Overnight, if your customer base doubles in size, what's not going to break? What would break? When you start talking about 10x, overnight, if your customer increases 10x overnight, at that point, it's usually what's not going to break. What system is actually going to stand up? What infrastructure is going to stand up? And you start having interesting conversations about indexing strategies or sharding strategies or auto-scaling strategies. And you realize that there may be certain blind spots that you have. And then there's always if your customers increase 100x overnight, if you think about the system that can handle that load, what does that even look like? Are you even headed in the right direction to be able to scale towards, do you have the patterns and processes in place to be able to scale to that volume? That's an example of horizontally scaling. How many customers becomes too much? But then vice versa, how big of a customer is too big? Is there a case where a customer has too much data, too many users, interacts with your application too much? How do you define too big from an application case? How is that going to affect your database tables, your infrastructure decisions? What is going to break if you take your largest customer and 2x that? Take your largest customer, 10x that, 100x that. What's going to happen in those cases? Once you define a scaling strategy, you need to make sure that you have systems in place to observe that. Make sure that you mind your blind spots. Do not make assumptions that everything's okay. If you don't know, assume the worst. Know where you are and take those by taking those measurements. And remember, capacity is not capacity and stability are not a Boolean state. It's a continuum. You're rolling down the runway. when are you at the point where you have to make a decision? And do you have all the information necessary? Don't be surprised when you're at the end of the runway and you're not going fast enough or you don't have the flaps out. Make sure you have everything in place and know where you are. The difficult question that I really like to ask honestly goes back to intelligence. Do you know what you don't know? Where are your blind spots? What are you not measuring? And then also, once you've identified some of those blind spots, or maybe even when you're trying to think of them, which looming decisions would be the most disruptive? Make sure you're measuring those so you have all the information necessary. You know where you are on that runway. And it's really hard to get right, but don't let it seem like too big of a task. There's a whole ecosystem of tooling and integrations around almost every technology, every programming framework, every cloud. There's a lot of really smart people out there that want to make this easier, and they like solving difficult problems. Your problems aren't new. And if you're a developer, you know that. You've been on Stack Overflow and you've seen the posts from 2-3 years ago searching the exact area you're searching. This goes back to standing on the shoulder of giants. Use what's there. Don't feel like you always have to come up with your own solution doing things the hard way. Remember, the most expensive part of the cloud is between the keyboard and the chair. So, the difficult question, which I always like to ask, is how do you make money? What does your company do that pulls in revenue? Is it running your own Kubernetes cluster? Is it managing your on-premises data center? Is it building your own logging framework? I ask those silly questions because I've worked at companies that have done all of those things. Did that give us an advantage in the end? I don't know. You really have to answer that question for yourself. And then you ask, if those things are not running your own Kafka cluster, for example, if that doesn't earn you money, if Kafka doesn't matter as the underlying infrastructure, why do you do that? What advantage does it give you? Are you getting an advantage, or are you losing out on opportunity cost by not using those engineering resources better? Remember, there's a time and a place to build versus buy. Use frameworks or build something custom. Outsource or even build your own and own your own solution. But you need to know when is that time and when's that place. Take that in mind and set yourself up for success. Above all, remember, it's an ecosystem. You live in the tech community. There's a quote floating around the internet of, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's also true with tech products. Being able to leverage the expertise of others, whether it's hiring new expertise and bringing that in-house, whether that's relying on a consulting firm or professional services, or if that's using a managed service provider. Make sure that you know what's going to give you advantage and how you can best use that. So the questions I like to ask is, realize that at the end of the day, your vendors are a business. Managed service providers provide a service in exchange for money. How do they make that money? How do they grow? What are their goals with you? Are there goals to just grow your account 100% year over year? Or are there different mechanisms where they can define mutual success? And think about how that affects your relationship. At Aiven, we strive every day to work on the right things, knowing where we are. We try to put all these principles that we talked about today in place so that we are not only successful, but mutually our customers and all of our vendors and all the supporting platforms that we build on top of are successful. Aiven's a database as a service platform, and we're built by developers for developers to make developers' lives better. Just like out in the industry, there's a lot of smart people working at Aiven. There's a lot of smart people using Aiven. We like to partner with people to solve difficult problems. Start a free trial and reach out to the experts at Aiven. Let's work on really hard problems together.